Okay, thank you so much, Kendra, and thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks for getting the possibility to speak to you. So I will try to limit myself to around 45 minutes, and after that, it would be great to have if you have some questions, feel free to ask them. Also, you can do that during the presentation, but we have quite some time afterwards. And it would also be great to maybe have a little discussion on the challenge of transitioning away from fossil fuels, because Norway and Canada have a lot in common, you know, as oil producing states. And it's also very interesting for me and for the Norwegian delegation to learn from the context here. So in my master's thesis, I have been researching the emerging geographies of the so-called oil and gas decommissioning sector. So that is the branch of fossil industry dealing with shutting down, removing, and recycling disused offshore structures. So this is also the subject of my PhD, which I recently started, where I will also take a look at offshore wind. I will try to get the next slide here. Yeah. So just to give you an impression of kind of the North Sea and all the physical structures out there, there's been an immense development in the last 5 decades of sort of oceanic built environments. There's a lot of whole lot of structures out in the North Sea, and here on this map you can see the purple dots are fixed installations standing on the continental shelf, producing oil and/or gas, and the yellow ones are floating, and you have a lot of pipelines and infrastructure crisscrossing the whole North Sea. So you can imagine at this moment there are thousands of workers out there getting ready to maybe go to sleep or have their night shifts. So it's kind of almost an urbanization process of the ocean, which has been going on for many decades now. So in a rapidly warming world, the question of what to do with this landscape, or carbonscape, as you could call it, is something we have to ask ourselves. And globally, there are over 7,000 offshore oil and gas platforms. And if we are to have a chance of keeping global warming below, well below 2 degrees in accordance with the Paris target, a substantial amount of these structures will have to be put out of commission sooner rather than later. So now I will just give you some political context in Norway, and trying to answer the question, why is it so hard for us as one of the richest countries in the world to start the transitioning process away from oil and gas? Because one would assume that we are fairly well placed to undertake such a project. But in Norway, the discourse underlining the importance of jobs in the oil and gas sector is very strong. And we have over 70,000 workers directly employed in the industry, and many more indirectly relying on these jobs. So the fear that shutting down this industry will lead to a society-wide calamity is very present in the national debate. And in a way, this is not hard to understand. Norway was already a welfare state before finding oil in 1969. but what we call the black gold has significantly increased the collective wealth since then. And there's also kind of a successful, an actual successful development of state ownership, control over fields, and progressive taxation, no? And also demands of local content in contracting out kind of the construction of platforms and so forth, leading to certain regions being very kind of tied into the oil economy, and leading to kind of yeah, so we've seen that there's the whole country has benefited kind of from the oil and gas industry, but also there's specific regions that have been very integrated in this economy. And there's another, what I would call a very important factor for why kind of there's a huge, today a significant majority in favor of continuing the exploration of new oil and gas resources and the continued extraction of oil and gas, which is the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. So actually, it would be interesting to do it now, but maybe you can do it yourself afterwards. But you can go into, you can just Google the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and you will come to this page with a number that is constantly moving, usually upwards. So you can track kind of the growth, like the accumulation of this fund in real time. And it's a very powerful image, no? That kind of all Norwegians know about this and kind of get some feeling of I don't know, security or something like that, looking at this development. But of course, there's a very, yeah, and by the way, if you want to know this in Canadian numbers, it would be just strike 1 digit approximately, but it's still, for me, it's it's a yeah, it's a number. It's hard to kind of wrap your head around. And so what we call the Norwegian Oil Fund actually own 1% of all registered stocks in the world. So it's become a huge thing, and of course it also has a dark side to it, which is very relevant these days, and that is the investments in, for example, the occupation of Palestine and kind of profiteering from the current ongoing war, which is now being debated in Norway. But there's a sense because of this that everyone's in on it also, no? Because this is a public fund. Yes, and just some. I want to explain a little bit about the role of unions also and organized labor in Norway as well, and as kind of a Nordic social democracy, that we have this tripartite system where it's almost a corporatist system where organized labor sit around the table together with the state and representatives of employers and business, and workers generally, organized labor have a say. They're part of processes. They might not agree on the outcome of those processes, but on a lot of major discussions, they're a significant actor, with also a lot of structural power within that system. And the degree of organization is also quite high in Norway. So my point here is that unions are important. And within those unions, oil workers has quite a lot of they carry a lot of weight when it comes to deciding oil policy of the major union. The major union is called LO and is an umbrella with different sectors, and this has traditionally been the way they decide on the union's policy on different areas. Oil workers decide or get the most say on kind of oil policy, which has led to a dynamic where kind of the union has been part of what could be called an oil industrial complex, where they generally are favorable to expanding fossil industry. So, for example, the slogan "Develop, not shut down" in Norwegian, "Utvikle, ikke avvikle," which is better because it rhymes. It's become kind of now it's echoed by even like the Minister of Environment, but you've heard this coming from unions a long time. So during the pandemic, there was something quite spectacular that happened, and it was an oil tax break, where I think by now there's like 69 billions of taxes that kind of Norway has lost because of these tax breaks, and for 3 years there's been huge incentives basically to start up new oil and gas projects, and this was I think it was very important that you had two local unions at two like industrial towns that mobilized and lobbied for this plan, and I'm tempted to use kind of, or to draw on the term sort of a shock doctrine, no, of Naomi Klein, where you have suddenly a crisis and an exceptional situation, and then those that have kind of a plan and mobilize for it can easier get it through, because the debate afterwards has been that this has been a very way too generous kind of it has led to skills kind of going, a lot of workers going to this sector, to the supply sector of oil and gas, and then kind of it's hard, but on the other side it's hard for municipalities, like a small medium municipality in Norway, to get maybe the engineer you need to work with adaptation, for example. So in a relatively small economy as Norway, this led to kind of an even heavier steering towards oil and gas dependency. And then this is a picture of one of the northernmost towns, if not the northernmost town in Norway, which is Hammerfest, where you have a liquefied natural gas plant on this island, and it's a very big part of the economy. So, and in general, in the national debate, a municipality like this will have politicians that are generally very much or important voices, kind of forwarding also a further expansion of oil and gas. And right now, there's also plans on the table of expanding, kind of making new small towns around kind of receiving oil and gas from the Barents Sea, from the far north, from the Arctic, and this would kind of add on to a sort of a momentum where new petrogeographies would kind of course, be very tied to have a lot of interests, vested interests. Okay, so that was just quickly some context for you, and what we're up against when we're talking about the transition away from oil and gas in Norway. But even though the extractive policy continues, some wells in North Sea are emptying out. And what you see in this picture, I took this when I did my field work during my master's, and it's a demolition yard belonging to a Norwegian company in the innermost part of the Vads fjord in southwestern Norway. And it's the largest site of its kind in the country. And it's been in operation since the mid-2000s, today employing somewhere around 100 people in the small municipality of Vindafjord. So here, gigantic old structures from all over the North Sea are brought in to be cut into pieces, sorted into appropriate containers, and then they are shipped off either to melting furnaces in the far north of Norway or the European continent. And here you see a picture of one of the heaviest objects being moved by humans, which is the troll platform. And this was actually also made in this same fjord. So it kind of gone full circle from, and this has a geographical explanation. It's easier to get these platforms kind of into the fjords. The waters are calm, and the depth is also it's very deep. So whereas people were constructing structures like this in the 70s, 80s, there are some people now working within decommissioning. And the reason for these structures being removed in the first place is not due to the outlook for companies' profits, but rather because of regulations. So in the 90s, the oil supermajor Royal Dutch Shell proposed abandoning the floating oil storage tank Brent Spar in the Atlantic. So this plan got considerable backlash with high-profile campaigns from Greenpeace, which I learned today was actually founded here in Vancouver. They boarded the Brent Spar and demanded that Shell cleaned up its mess, basically, because it was still containing large quantities of oil sludge and other toxic residue. So an actual battle between the activists and Shell security personnel in boats ensued, and the case got a lot of public exposure. And Shell finally caved in to the demands when the prospects of a larger Europe-wide boycott of the company was starting to look very real. So partially because of the drama surrounding the Brent Spar, the Oslo-Paris Convention, known as OSPAR, came into place some years later. And it essentially banned the abandonment of disused offshore structures in the Northeast Atlantic. So from then on, you had to remove basically all the oil platforms and floating rigs like this. So because of earlier struggles, institutions and regulations are very important and kind of the whole foundation for this industry working as it does today. And I would say there's also, this is also, when I've been thinking about it, I also see it as a way for the state to regulate between between its need for circulation of goods, of capital, fishing, and all of these things requiring free roaming of the seas, and on the other hand, kind of fixed capital and sites of extraction. So on the one hand, the Norwegian state, for example, has been incentivizing a lot of production historically, but the policy is that when you're done extracting, you have to remove the structure. So apart from being a necessity compelled by global warming, decommissioning and recycling also makes sense from another environmental perspective. So by far the largest part of an oil platform is made up of steel, but they also contain a substantial amount of aluminium, copper, And this is also something that is needed for the construction of, for example, wind turbines. So recycling these materials has a substantially lower emissions output than the industrial production of virgin materials. And so the decommissioning industry could, with some justification, claim to be one of the green ones out there. So building the future society in a carbon-constrained world would have to entail making use of the physical infrastructure already inherited from fossil capital in this way. So this is suggested by research grappling with how to drastically cut emissions while at the same time constructing a whole new landscape that is put to producing renewable energy. So another active decommissioning yard where I did which I visited during my master's. I say field work, but it was kind of 10, 11 days, so it wasn't really that long. And this is one of the municipalities in Norway with the highest employment rate within the oil and gas sector, known for its large supply industry. But it has also a demolition yard that has been in operation since the late 1990s. And this was the first site where a large onshore dismantling process took place in Norway. So while today employing north of 100 people in this activity, the figure is set to increase drastically over the coming decade. And I guess you can't really read these figures, but so here we are in 2024. This is the projections of the total tonnage of things coming in from the Norwegian continental shelf. Yeah, so as you see, there's an expected peak around 2028. This is topsides and this is substructures. But you get the idea that we are still, like, the big peak is still ahead of us in time. So what is currently going on is just kind of a little taste of what is to come. So this is not because of a shift in Norwegian state policy towards phasing out oil and gas, but rather because of the structures themselves have become worn out, or because the oil fields they stand on are approaching the limits of what can be extracted with a profit. So even though the activity of dismantling is easily dwarfed by the number of people working in the supply industry right next to the demolitioning yard, I found that decommissioning was seen as an important way of diversifying the local economy in Stord, the local industry. And moreover, what is interesting with these two yards in the discussion about climate jobs is that they represent an industry which has a high degree of overlap in the skills that are needed. So there's an overlap in skills from that of constructing the very same structures, such as welding, scaffolding, cutting and burning, or operating larger machines. So the very same people that are today making the fixed structures of the fossil industry can just as easily or quite easily be engaged with its dismantling. And it's virtually the same people that are needed, or the same skills. And geographically, here we see a map with the two places I visited, Stord and Vats. Geographically, these are in the heart of the Norwegian oil region, with the looming prospect of becoming the new Rust Belt of Norway if the oil and gas industry is suddenly shut down. So both yards have either arisen directly on or in the adjacency of former construction sites for the supply industry. And therefore, each job that can be created, let's say, in this region would help alleviate the social turmoil that could ensue from a rapid phase out of offshore oil and gas in what is a vulnerable region in this scenario. So two of the first groups of workers that would have to find something else to do in case of a phase out is the supply industry, which is a cornerstone industry in Stord here. Moreover, the people working with exploration of new oil and gas. This is a drilling rig in the North Sea. They also use the same rigs for an essential part of the decommissioning process, namely the plugging and abandonment of oil wells. So this is kind of good news for the climate jobs discourse. That the scaling up of decommissioning would at least absorb some of the same people that are today working with the expansion of the oil and gas industry, either through drilling for new oil or making new rigs and platforms. So the prospect of jobs tied to decommissioning will come in a decade where it is essential to move away from oil and gas, but where it might take time to establish alternatives of scale for the jobs currently in the oil and gas sector. So a believable plan for new relevant jobs is necessary to get unions on board generally. So a focus on new jobs that could sugar the pill of a transition and alleviate the potential hardships of losing gainful employment in the oil and gas sector will be invaluable in the time ahead. So in this respect, I found that the local union at Stord were actually positive to upscaling decommissioning and dismantling activities. The only catch is that at the same time they would absolutely like to see continued national investments in new oil and gas projects as well. But I think it's interesting to see that the demolitioning yard is seen kind of as an opportunity and as a diversifying kind of activity in the community, also by shop stewards. So these union members are, of course, also painfully aware of the situation, that the situation we face with global warming. And research suggests that oil workers are not more skeptical to measures against oil and gas, given that they are ensured relevant and meaningful new employment. And then the question, of course, is if, what's actually the qualitative aspects of this emerging sector within decommissioning? Is it what we call a decent job, or is it dirty and dangerous, let's say? So, and just as a disclaimer, the amount of new jobs is not the only hallmark of a successful transition. And one example why this is because of automation in the demolition yards is one contributing reasons why relatively small numbers are found in this branch of industry in Norway today, which is again important in order for workers to avoid dangerous tasks. So, for example, if you can be in a machine that can do like a cutting of steel far away from like the point of energy, that is a huge that is much safer. But generally, you will require far less people rather than like if you did it more like manually. Yeah. So research into the prospects of employment in oil and gas decommissioning might seem irrelevant in the big picture, and as of today, it mostly is. But as I already mentioned, the number is rising every year, and projections show that it will continue to do so in the coming decades. In the coming decade, with millions of tons set to come on shore from the North Sea, only the next 10 years. And this is, of course, not taking into account the possibility of a policy intervention from the state, for example, for actually phasing out and shutting down the fossil industry. But just due to the ongoing wear and tear of the structures themselves and depletion of wells. So one of the largest challenges that I found for upscaling the decommissioning activity was that it is extremely hard for companies in this branch to predict exactly when large contracts will be landed, when there will be work for them. And this is because of oil prices. As we know, they are extremely volatile, and you also have new technologies constantly being available for the extraction for oil fields in the tail phase of production. So these are constantly developed, prolonging the life expectancy of oil fields all over the North Sea as a general tendency. So for instance, oil fields that were originally projected depleted by the 90s are still producing today. And what you can see from this chart, this is in Norwegian, so I'm not trying to explain, but you have all these are different fields in the North Sea, and the dark blue color is the expected production time of the fields, whereas the lighter blue is the actual production time, and the red dots are cessation and decommissioning. With new technology, with rising oil prices, generally you've had a significant expansion and extension of these the life of a platform. So due to the constantly changing circumstances, oil companies can change their plans on a whim, leading to the majority of the people employed in onshore decommissioning being temporary workers, hired for peak conjunctures of activity. And this dynamic, with the majority of workers coming from temp agencies, has repercussions for the local community receiving less taxes, for example. And you have workers coming to live in barrack towns or on hotels in a quite segregated way. So, for example, when I went on this, what I call a field trip to Stord, but if there's any anthropologists here, it was more like a small trip. I checked into, I tried to check into a hotel, thinking that this was the autumn, it was not the tourist season, and it's a relatively small town, and I thought like they will have a room for me. But what I found out was that the hotel was packed because it was like a boom period for the construction industry or the supply industry. So these, and in general, both the supply industry and like the demolition industry have a base of employment, and then they bring in a lot of temporary labor power for kind of peaks, production peaks. So I ended up staying like at the camping, the local camping, in like an actual container with like a little window, and it was quite interesting. And I saw that there was also other workers, kind of none of those, the other people there were actual campers either. It was just temporary workers. So this has led to yeah, and most importantly, temp workers are generally less unionized than their full-time counterparts. So this has led to a division amongst the workers and the formation of a and B team on the shop floor. And I think the term precarity is very relevant here. Like you have some workers that are highly precarious, temporary contracts. And this is a challenge to solidarity. You have a minority of permanent workers who believe that they can have these this privileged position because there is high use of temp workers that takes that can actually handle the peaks in demand. And since this is a potentially quite dangerous activity, like being a decom or demolition worker, you might be working with a lot of heights. There's potentially asbestos, low radioactive material. You have steel structures with a lot of tension. So you have to know where to cut, and all of these aspects makes it more dangerous if you have new people coming on the site constantly. And historically, there has been several fatal accidents on the demolition yard in Stord. Yeah, so it's not favorable to health and safety on sites. The large turnover in general, one could safely say. So, but what is interesting is that if there was actually planned phase out of oil and gas activity, staffing. So this is maybe a bit like utopian thinking, but for this specific industry, you could have staffing that was planned on these sites. You had a staffing that allows for a steady base of full-time workers engaged with demolition and recycling of metals from different North Sea structures. And they could know when kind of these structures were coming in, and they could kind of do this in a consciously planned fashion, instead of today, where you have very much like a volatile market deciding when these activities are going to take place. So going beyond just oil and gas decommissioning, there will also be a need for handling old offshore wind turbines in the near future, as well as the fleet of ships running on fossil fuels. So the latter category is today almost exclusively being sent off to Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, where they are brought onto beaches when there's a high tide, and they are manually kind of broken apart piece by piece. So vessels used in the North Sea offshore industry has actually ended up also in Southeast Asia on a beach like this. Here you see a drilling rig in the background. And this is made possible by legal loopholes. Today it's not legal, but since this is technically a vessel, it has its own propeller. What usually happens is there's a change of ownership, and there's a change of the flag, and then somehow it ends up on a beach. Anyways, you also have Turkey, which is quite interesting. They have yards, demolition yards that are has a sign of approval from the OECD, but they also have generally more relaxed regulation when it comes to environmental standards, and unionization there is non-existent. So if Norway wants to stop this practice and take responsibility of its own fleet, for example, you could also create like linkages between oil and gas decommissioning and shipbreaking, and thinking more about circularity. So we also have another challenge, which is offshore wind. So whereas the first major quantities of wind turbines that have to be put out of commission is also set to gradually increase throughout the coming decade, with the first generation of offshore turbines reaching their 20-year life expectancy. Yeah, offshore wind will represent far larger volumes in terms of physical structures and tonnages than that of oil and gas, and the disparity is set to increase with the expansion of offshore wind, which is currently spurred by the energy crisis. And the yards tasked with the recycling and dismantling of fixed fossil structures today could very well continue to work with the rational recycling of other parts of the marine built environment, or at least it's interesting to see whether that will happen or not. On the other hand, if the laws of an unrestrained logic of capitalist value gets to dominate, the most likely outcome is that disused structures in the ocean are sent off to the global south, where externalities of both pollution and precarious labor conditions will secure the highest profits from recycled metals. Yes, and this is just a photo and an example of what can happen when the cheapest solution is sought. And this is a drilling rig called the Transocean Winner, which was in service in the Norwegian continental shelf for many years before it was eventually set for Turkey to be demolished there. But during a storm on the outside of Scotland, it broke away and kind of crashed into the coastline. And here we have like a graveyard in this Scottish island in the forefront, and it's a quite spectacular and dramatic scene. But of course, there are certain problems with relying on transporting these things all the way to Turkey. But yeah, this I will also be investigating more now to what extent this is actually happening, because during when I researched for my master's thesis, it was mostly for like looking at the North Sea region and not as much like how its connection to places like Turkey. So now I would like to actually go to one of the yards in Turkey to inquire further. So alternatively, the structures can be simply abandoned or dumped into the ocean. Like that would require a change in regulation. But this is certainly an approach that the fossil industry itself has been keen to promote, having the promise of artificial reefs as a highly favorable for marine life. So we face a situation where potential resources end up as pollution, either in the form of residual oil sludge in tanks and pipes, or the paint scaling from wind turbines or jacket rigs. But through a planned phase-out of oil and gas, the fossil infrastructures of today could form quite literally the basis for the renewable infrastructures of tomorrow, while ensuring that both former oil workers and the regions are not left behind, which is a foundational demand within a just transition. Yes, and I think I've used up 45 minutes already, but I just wanted to mention that before coming here, I did some research on Canada just to look at what's the situation here with kind of all your oil wells around the country. And so I found that the idea of creating jobs through the process of cleaning up and shutting down is in no way unique to the North Sea. So what happened during the pandemic here in British Columbia was that 120 million was set aside in subsidies for starting actually cleaning up what is called orphaned wells, or wells that are kind of without any owner anymore. So the true benefits of this will not be seen before maybe 16 years, as I understood it, because that's the limit when most of the wells in BC would have to be decommissioned. But during the pandemic, just to secure the employment of people working within this sector, there was actually a project started here, and the same in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And it's interesting, in Alberta, I also found that there were First Nations involved in this, like as contractors in these projects of well decommissioning. And I saw one quote from one First Nation leader expressing that this subsidy and this process should continue because it was stopped in 2023. And it's also kind of the demand of land back is kind of getting some additional meaning when you see like the process of actually making these areas available again. And just as a finishing thought, this very spectacular and quite dystopic landscape of tar sands, I guess this is also very much the case now, that the process of reclamation is something that I would assume that takes a lot of work, but it's a potential point of solidarity maybe between indigenous interests and environmentalists and unions, hopefully. Yes. So that was it for my presentation. So I see one hand and one question already, so maybe we can just go right to that. Or a comment.
Actually,